Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Metzler, one of the programmers at SF Doc Fest. Really excited to be here and be able to kind of share films with you both in person at the Roxy and also streaming here online. As you know, we love to kind of tell lots of different stories here at SF Doc Fest. And when we saw this film, Meantime, come through submissions by local filmmaker Michael Workman, we knew that we wanted to have it part of the festival. And we're lucky enough to have Michael here to do a Q&A. Thanks again for being here.
Thanks for having me.
One of the things I think, many of our audience always wonder is like, how do, filmmakers, find their subjects and what makes them know that they want to kind of tell a story. This story is a little bit different in the sense of, it being a personal nature. At what point in time did you decide that you wanted to kind of pick up a camera and kind of go down this rabbit hole?
So I was living in Palo Alto, finishing my degree at Stanford at the time when the pandemic hit, and I kind of randomly found myself back in Missoula, where I'm from, that summer, and ended up staying for a long time. And during that summer, I was spending a lot of time with my dad and helping him out and just hanging out. And I was coming up with ideas of films that I could make while like working under the constraints of the pandemic. And basically my dad was the only person other than my roommates at the time that I wasn't socially distant from. And so we had been talking a lot about this other film idea that I had about this drug rehabilitation program that turned into a cult in Petaluma that my dad was in when he was a kid. And so it kind of started from there. And then that idea became too big, and there were some issues around archival, securing rights to the archival, because there was other money interest involved. And so I was thinking about, at that time, I was already filming with him, and a lot of things were coming up from our relationship, and it was kind of like a helpful way for me, or an excuse for me, to like talk about things that we talk about sometimes, but never in like a structured manner. And so I started just developing this idea that would be more about him. And I had been thinking about his story and my story through his, and for a lot of my films, like I think it's like a kind of like story that, and like a personality type that I'm drawn to for like other films that I've made.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And so I ended up just like thinking of this idea, and I thought it through really well, and then like very like detailed before I really started filming. And then I just started filming with him with like a pretty like rigid set of like creative constraints that I gave myself. And then, yeah, we filmed it I ended up staying in the winter. I didn't think I would be there. And so then I'd stayed there for about 6 months and shot the film probably over the course of about 3 months. And by the end of it, we were both ready to be done. So we were both really, really over it. So, yeah.
Now, obviously, you had a very specific idea for the film when it began. But I wonder, like, would you see your dad as a kind of a collaborator on this film at all? And also, was there anything that kind of just surprised you or changed the way, kind of what you were originally envisioning the film to be, that kind of evolved over the course of actually really making it?
Yeah, I mean, my dad would definitely say that he was not a collaborator in it. He would be like, I don't know what I did. You're just there, blah, blah, blah. But I think he totally was. In that, like, a lot of the conversations were like kind of directed by me, but not really. And that like we had talked through like a lot of different ideas for different things that like I wanted to get. So I think we definitely like collaborated on it. I think my dad would say that like I did all the work, but I don't think that's the case. And also like he did the brunt probably of the emotional labor too, in the film, even though it was like also a lot for me. And then the second part of the question was,
were there any surprises or anything that kind of like changed the evolution of the sort of story you were telling once you started filming with him?
I think that like one of the major things that changed was I think it was more nuanced and intense than I thought it would be. Like a lot of the footage that just like we happened to get, I think was like really compelling to me. And I was not necessarily expecting that. And so in the original idea, there I was playing with like using my voiceover to like fill in gaps and to like make it be a narrative that would be like followable.
Hmm.
And a good friend of mine, Johnny Owen, who's in Oakland now, he watched like an early cut with like me playing with narration. It was just like, don't do this. This is not you. You didn't do this. Like you have a lot of compelling footage. Like you don't need to. And so it really like start like I tend to veer towards the side of observational filmmaking always. And so that's my interest. And I think that's my strength. And so the film became like a personal film that's really just like an observational film about my dad. And I would say it's like an observational film specifically through my perspective of my dad, and that's the personal part of it rather than like me giving like internal dialogue or insight that way.
And do you think the presence of the camera, did that change? How do you think that the presence of the camera in doing this project kind of changed your all's relationship, or even gave you the freedom to, I guess, go down the different paths that you did?
Yeah, I mean, I when I was conceptualizing this idea and while I was making it, I was thinking a lot about how the camera in these situations becomes like a catalyst for like creating a situation. Like it's like a conflict in itself that like creates a scenario that wouldn't exist outside of the camera. And so I think like with this film, it's like I had to set up the camera and like walk away and like be present in the film and and then like just see what would happen and unfold in the presence of the camera. And I think that it was kind of like an agitational force,
Mm,
talk about things that we wouldn't have necessarily talked about in such like a structured or deep way.
mm.
um but I also think that like the camera like changed my perspective. Like it was really really hard for me to be able to like shut off my director brain and just be present in life. I don't think I ever really got there with this film, because I was thinking about like, are the batteries out? And are we in the frame? Like, is it out of focus? Like, is the
Yeah.
sound good? You know? And at the same time, I'm also trying to be like a son and be a person in a film who's, you know, who's just existing. And I think there was a few moments where that worked, and I think there was a lot where it didn't. And I think that that kind of helped the film in some ways because it became a film much more about my dad than because like the footage wasn't really there to develop me that much. Uh,
Mm.
but I liked it better as like an idea of my perspective as the character rather than just like me as like a really fleshed out character in the film.
Yeah. Well, I think it's just a really cool film, and even more so given the pandemic. So I'm glad the pandemic inspired some cool art and creativity out there. And I think my last question for you is that, like, um, when you decided that you wanted to be kind of a documentary filmmaker, a filmmaker, what was your dad's reaction? And do you think it surprises him that you became a documentary filmmaker or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think he was surprised, but always like very supportive of it. I think it's interesting. Like he was always filming when I was growing up. Like that's like where the footage in the film comes from. But I wasn't really ever interested in cameras that like as a kid. Like I didn't become interested in cameras until like middle school when I could make like stupid movies with my friends. And so I feel like I'm in a strange place where my dad's more of a documentary filmmaker in some ways because he's really interested in documenting life.
Mm,
And I feel like less, I'm interested in that, but I'm more interested in like the stories, documenting the stories and like the feelings of people. And so like the camera for me is like a way to like create a whole thing, and the individual footage itself is less meaningful to me.
okay,
Uh,
right.
so I don't, it's, yeah, I think he's surprised, but at the same time, I think he was like, well, I had the camera around all the time, and that's like why you got interested in it. And I think we come weirdly serendipitously come into it from like really different interests, and different like goals, I guess, with like creating documents of life.
Well, cool. Well, thanks again for sharing meantime with us, Michael. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.